I am now going to read out my essay on Matthew chapters 15 to 21, subtitled, What is Faith and the Origins of the Church? We're a rational people as far as reason takes us, and we want to take it to the very end. We want reason and logical principles to determine what we do or think or feel. When I say we, I mean us Western Europeans. That's why I have no particular affection for the notion of faith, or not until recently. I came to the Church in Christ through reasoning and practical meditation. Luckily for me, I had already rationally concluded that the aim of life is theosis, or becoming the Son of God, and that the kingdom of heaven is within you without the application of faith. But the Gospels certainly do say that faith in Christ, and also therefore in God, is the essential attribute which makes a man a son of God. So I'm going to examine what faith is as far as I understand it, and I must expect that I already have it without being aware of it. And it's simply a case that I don't know that I have faith. Faith must be essential to being a son of God and to theosis. I think I can explain what it is by reference to my other interests, namely my interest in meditative prayer. I will show that faith in Christ grows through that prayer. What I understand by the word faith is not merely an interest and belief in a set of ideas. I mean that faith is not a mental activity of believing in some facts. Rather, it's a state of the heart and the mind, rather than a set of ideas in the mind. To be brief, to get to what I will say later on in more length, faith is made possible by the silent prayer, and therefore to attain to faith you must pray the disciplined, methodical prayer which the ancient ascetics described. This is how it will be possible to reconcile the secret message inherent in Christ's sayings and how to understand it when he tells us how to pray. Prayer and faith are the same thing, except that prayer is an act, while faith is a state of mind and heart. The one leads to the other. When the mother of the lunatic approaches the disciples in Matthew and they cannot cure the illness, Christ tells them that to perform this miraculous act of healing requires prayer and fasting. Matthew 17:15 to 21. And this is because prayer leads to faith, and faith can do anything, since for God nothing is impossible. And the faith is therefore unity with God, a state of union of the self with God. And this is how we should also understand the saying that when you ask God for anything while in a state of faith, it can be heard and granted. That's Matthew 21, verse 22. Where faith is complete, a man has become the Son of God, and his will is God's will, and therefore what he asks for will certainly be granted. I say we are a rational people, and I first of all want to have a look at this idea of how rational we are and what this means for us. I have recently been reading William Empson, 1906 to 1984, and his essays on the poets in his book Using Biography from 1984. Empson's essays from the 1970s on Yeats, Eliot and Joyce, who were the foremost English-speaking poets of the last century, were each written on the understanding that Empson thought that literary critics other than himself were too Christian, and they had interpreted the works of Joyce and Yeats in particular in an unwelcome Christian way. He must be referring to a time after the war when there was a flourishing of Christianity and of academic Christianity. I can't believe that this is the case anymore. So these essays are slightly dated, but they are the writings of one of the top 3 or 4 critics of literature of the last century. Empson takes it as his job to correct the taste of his time and to combat those critics who alleged that they were on the side of God and the Church. Empson's, I mean to say that Yeats and Joyce were on the side of the Church, which he takes issue with. Empson's motivation is evidently that he saw errors in the interpretations of these other critics. But his laser focus on this particular problem, his obsession with it, if you like, is because he disliked God. He disliked God the Father as a person. Even if Empson had been shown that God created the world and that he exists, and that God is what Christians say he is, Empson would still have disliked God. He takes exception to the sacrifice of Christ and a demand on Christians that they undergo suffering. These are recurrent themes in Empson's work. He mocks God as a God of bloodthirstiness in a quite rational way. It was a recurrent theme with him, this eminent English literary critic, that he disliked God. And this is the substance of another of his books, Milton's, which he titled Milton's God, which is a study of Milton's poetry. And I get the impression that it was a lifelong interest of his, this attack on God. I suppose Empson, who I take to be the standard of English understanding, would ask, why didn't God make the world so that suffering was not built into it? And he asks, who would worship such a God who had made the world like that? It's a rational question. But to me, this classic rational position, this question direct from the heart of a sceptical English reasonable man, which argues that life is too cruel, is itself founded on the deeper belief that life is just too cruel in itself. What prompts us to ask men like Empson, which prompts us to ask him, do you want to live at all under these conditions? Is it God who approves of suffering that you dislike, or is it just life itself as it is that in itself that you dislike? For if we set aside the thesis that God made this world, the suffering would still remain, and it would still be found objectionable by these people. They would still find life objectionable. Perhaps I have not explained this very well. What I mean is, given our lives as they seem to be, with pains and constant unease, we are obliged to accept that situation and make the most of it, and to understand it. As Christians, we do understand it to some extent, and we understand why there is unease and pain. We accept the life, and therefore we are already able to accept that God gives us pains for whatever reason. But if Empson, who I offer here as the standard non-Christian rational man, objects to God sending us pain, it's because he does not accept the pain and the trials of life at all. He does not accept the trials of life. He wants to do something about them. And there is an explanation for this, I suppose. Empson was a socialist, if not a communist. And he does not accept the conditions of life under which we live. Socialism is a purely rational answer to the situation we are in, we people who want things to be perfect by our own efforts. We rationalists believe that the practical man, the rational man, is something like an ideal. And Empson, the English spirit, taking the man alone with himself as our initial situation, our default position in existence, wants to improve it, wants to improve on it. To be a socialist in economic matters, to be a technologist, to mitigate all the pains and unease of existence. But behind it all, he does not accept life, and does not accept the way God has given it. I find this hard to take. When Daniel Defoe wrote the first English novel, he described the Englishman on a desert island, and the roots of Empson's attitude are to be found there. That man on the island does not set about reconciling himself with God, as it were, in the desert. Rather, he builds a small technological culture and sets about improving his situation. And it is in this sense that I say we are all rational. And I do contrast this with the situation of a man with faith, whose principal job is to become accustomed to his circumstances and to make the relation with God his priority. One of the reasons I do not consent to socialist politics is that I not only see our situation as good enough already, and I accept the pain and the unease, and then go searching for God, which is the consequence of this acceptance. It's that I think all socialist projects fail. They don't fail empirically. We notice this after we've seen them tried out and then fail. They fail because of human beings are contradictory, and we can never satisfy our ambitions. We're kind of an amphibious two-part being with two natures. Man belongs by nature to heaven and to earth. So when he treats himself alone, as an earthly thing with rational desires, his purposes and objectives always fail, because they have inadvertent consequences which he hadn't foreseen and never could have foreseen. He defeats himself. Men never really know what they want, and their wishes always defeat their other purposes and their other needs. So, central planning and rational organisation of a purely human society will always be a failure and even turn into a nightmare if attempted. This is so at a personal level and at a national scale. This is why I found myself praying and meditating, because it's clear to me human beings cannot sort out their own problems unassisted. And whenever they try to do anything, the consequences are the reverse of what they intended. And I came to pray and meditate in this way, despite having no sense that, to put it in commas, I had no faith in the commonly accepted sense of that word. I could easily be convinced that for the English of today and the past, dissatisfaction with the arrangement of things, dissatisfaction with the gift of life made to us, has left us meddling and making a mess of things which are, we fail to admit, beyond our control. And Empson's contemptuous dismissal of what he calls the sacrificial, bloodthirsty God seems to me to be a dismissal of life itself. I would add one side note. This line of reasoning, when I say that Christians have to accept life, is the reason why the early church set aside and condemned Gnosticism. Because although the world is troubled and suffering, and from suffering itself and stupidity and poverty, we know that these things are always with us. And those, the stupidity, the poverty, the suffering, are not a good reason to set the world aside in total. They're things we have to accept. For reasons like this, theosis, becoming the Son of God, and even faith itself has never been a major part of the English culture. We are too practical, and I say we, as a community of the English speakers in our Western world. We are too practical for meditation and for acceptance. I can prove this by having found no indication of how important prayer, the silent prayer, is in our literature and philosophy. You could study the entire canon of literature and philosophy in the West and find no advice about how you should go about into finding a state of acceptance or approach to God through the silent prayer. Barely a trace of it in the poetry, the novels, the philosophy. There is no strong or even a weak tradition in English of the ascetic discipline and how we should achieve it. Rather, we have maybe inadvertently become technological socialists by and large. We've become mass society, progressive rationalists. When I use the word rationalism, I do not mean to say that the world can actually be grasped by reason alone. But the people who do think that reasoning and logic can solve all problems, they do have a faith that one way or another, eventually, reason can achieve that. I don't think so. Whether the rational project will succeed or fail, most people in England and the West are pursuing it. And faith is to most people either belief in some set of ideas and statements, or else it is nothing. What I mean by faith in this essay is something quite different. In the West, we shut down the monasteries and we gave up praying. I suppose I would like to try to fix this. I have come a long and roundabout route to get to Christianity and faith, in the contrary direction to my culture. And I end up being an advocate for prayer. But the stages of my journey went through Nietzsche and the anarchist and erotic works and ideas of George Bataille, who knew that man needs to be transformed, but who refused to allow that he should be transformed into a Christian. And I have come to prayer through Martin Heidegger, whose works are absurdly voluminous and obscure. But what I learned from Bataille and the rest is that this objective of sovereignty of the individual might have to be achieved through the irrational final act which we reach after long, careful thinking, and what you could call the greatest, most valuable sacrifice and achievement of reason, where it mutates into faith, pure belief, and silence. The final highest achievement of man is to approach God, beyond all things, beyond all life, and that the leap there means giving up the world, literally in Bataille's case, to consume and destroy what is most valuable in the world so as to achieve the highest aim. But the Christian prayer is not destructive in the same harmful way as the pure materialist and socialist presents the final leap, as Bataille does. And as I say, it's not a rejection of the world, it's kind of a perfection of it. What these people, Nietzsche and Bataille and Heidegger, showed was the courage and the unlimited demand for the absolute truth. And this desire for the absolute truth and this courage, this heroism, has been valuable to me, even in atheist thinkers of the extreme limit. So much for a short description of how I came to start praying and what I think faith is. When I write on prayer and theosis, I tell my deepest wishes. I write my deepest wishes out. I tell the secret. It leaves me empty. It leaves me more dissolute and careless than before I wrote things down. It leaves me more confined to the merely mundane and the secular. Because by telling the knowledge and experience that you've gained, you give it away. And to some extent, you no longer have it in your possession. And it's the same feeling after a magician has told the secret of his magic tricks. Other people have gained in knowledge, and the magician is drained of his magic. From me, the power and the mystery have gone. Christ, by contrast, often worked in secret and held his tongue, and ordered his disciples to do so. His way of speaking was frequently or purposely evasive, and perhaps what he had to say was impossible to express. And maybe he knew that at certain times it's better not to talk. His message was simple anyway. God cares for you, and I am God. It needs no explanation. As we know, when Christ did speak, to the masses especially, he spoke in parables. And very rarely, in the Gospels at least, does he tell the absolute truth of a situation. The saints were the same. Few saints wrote books or taught the intimate details of prayer in a theoretical way. The early saints had a saying, which to me seems to apply to the idea of maintaining your silence and not getting involved in communication. They said, "There are two things which an ascetic fears above all. Firstly, women, for obvious reasons, and secondly, bishops." And they said about the bishops, this is because the bishop will try to make a man enter into the world and start teaching and leading. So he'll find a holy ascetic and then say, "We've got a job for you in the world." Whereas teaching and leading are harmful to the inner cultivation of self and the love of God. I say so much to indicate that it costs me to explain things sometimes. And giving away what I think of as knowledge does affect my composure. It sets me back. It's not even logically coherent for somebody who believes as I do to also try to teach. Because if the single individual is sovereign and has within him the entire world, and if silent faith is the most important state he can attain, then where is the sense in speaking to this about other people? Where is the sense in speaking to other people about these things? It's a paradox that a man should teach others in public to be more individual and to become their unique true self. And it does feel as if it drains me to speak about these things. Nevertheless, the first principal effect of praying is that a person becomes more composed and more centered. He develops a sense of a self, which he might not have had before. He becomes a single person. So it's natural that he should be reluctant to then think of other people and to help them. The English are a typically cooperative people who work together, and they consider individualists to be eccentric. And becoming the Son of God, or theosis, as a pursuit, while it is at the heart of what the Church teaches, is not altogether harmonious with the spirit of a large organisation, such as a church. So, how the early Church itself allowed individual ascetics to flourish alongside the Church is a story of political compromises. In the West, individual hermits and saints were not encouraged at all. Rather, the ascetic tradition became a communal matter in the large houses governed by the rule of Saint Benedict and the other orders which followed the Benedictine one. In the West, hermits and ascetics were forced to find a place in the communal Cenobitic monasteries. However, in the East, the individualist who eschewed the Church was a type which was allowed. It is perhaps because the basic meaning of faith and the sure route to becoming a son of God was prohibited by the Western Church in the individualistic way that I mean it. It's because of this that the Reformation was so easy to achieve in our countries. Nietzsche said of Luther that Luther rebelled against the Church and brought about the Reformation because he failed to be a monk. You could say he didn't like being a monk, and I mean a monk in the Cenobitic authority-based type of monastery. Being a monk was to be subject to an externally applied discipline, and this might be why it was so easy to shut those houses down. There were basically no radically individual examples of asceticism going on there. They were not breeding grounds for true faith. If the monk in England had been allowed to be a single individual, he might have held on to the church and his Christianity more fiercely in the 1530s. For the freedom of the individual to work out his faith in God alone is heroic, and could have saved the church in England. But the Cenobitic communal Christians simply gave up when Thomas Cromwell's thieves arrived, because there is something weak and pointless about an organised ascetic life. It must rather be individualistic. How they work this out is another matter. It's a political matter. Now, what I mean by the prayer I have already discussed in previous talks. But here are some more indications of what I mean. When a man sits and prays silently and makes his way inwards, he does so while sitting. And in the example of St. Gregory Palamas, 1296, and following, that was his year of birth. According to Gregory Palamas, he should do so in a posture almost doubled over. This is important because the body which he describes of the man praying is the body of a man who is broken and humbled. It's the man of broken body and broken spirit. And having a broken spirit and mind is essential to the prayer. And the prayer, because the prayer is silent not only with the lips, but also silent in the mind, in the spirit, in the heart and the will. This is a very hard thing to achieve. I think that Locke, in his essay concerning human understanding, admits freely that the mind is never still, never. Now you could laugh and say, you didn't know about the silent prayer, but the silence of the mind is very hard after many years of practicing the silent prayer, although the peace and calm of the mind is progressively achieved. So if we establish that the mind is never still, and yet this is what we're aiming at, we're talking about completely breaking down the human personality, or the common everyday mind. The essential thing is that the mind does not experience a succession of ideas. That's what we're trying to achieve. That the mind does not think in a volitional way, in the sort of panicky, uneasy way in which we normally live our lives. It doesn't perceive or feel. It nevertheless lives for all that, but the common activities of the mind are put aside. But it's almost, if not entirely impossible, to stop thinking or to stop the ideas from passing successively through the mind, unless, that is, we are totally broken and at the limit of the self. A broken man has no interest in survival, for instance. He's already accepted his demise, you could say. And so he has every reason to stop worrying. He does not want to die, but he is indifferent to living or dying. And this is one of the ways in which a man's will, his inbuilt, uncircumventable will to survive, which largely inspires our ideas for the most part, can fall silent. This is why also tears are said to accompany the real prayer. Terrible as it sounds, and it is terrible, men weep when they are totally defeated, when they lose something of great importance to them. There's nothing you can lose that's greater of more importance than your will to survive, of will to exist as an individual in the common garden sense. But the prayer can only happen when a man loses his common or garden self and is therefore totally defeated as far as the world is concerned. And therefore tears flow, I would suppose, because the state of desolation has been achieved on purpose, which usually comes in the world by accident and usually causes such pain that we break into tears. But since the man praying has willed this to come about, and the heart is focused on God, the tears still flow, but then they could be called tears of happiness. I cannot claim to have cried like this myself while praying, but I only mean to explain what they are if they do appear. They're, as it were, the body and the soul's natural response to being deprived of everything, which in normal circumstances would make somebody cry, and in tears of grief. But knowing that this is being done for the sake of God and having that reward, they would be called tears of joy and humility. The prayer is only possible to begin with on a purely philosophical basis if we examine the mind itself. If we're trying to understand how this prayer is possible for human beings, and we haven't yet discussed the aspect of faith. You could say you pray out of faith. I don't really believe that's the case, actually, but because we pray because it's the natural thing for us to do. So if we look at the nature of the mind, we see that the mind is perfectly fitted for this kind of prayer. Firstly, our mind is already outside time. It's already eternal. Which is why Locke, 1632 to 1704, in his essay concerning human understanding, points out early on that our mind sometimes seems instantaneously to think a great many thoughts, gathering its ideas together and making judgments of great complexity in a split second. Our mind only has to follow a tedious progress of one point to another when we're trying to explain ourselves, but the mind usually sees deeply into things almost with infinite speed, with no time whatsoever. Our mind, if we give it any examination at all, is obviously above and outside time. It's above and outside ideas. It's above thoughts. Thoughts and ideas are principally what give us the sense of time anyway, and those things are independent of the mind. The mind is above them. Our state of mind now is more or less the same as our state of mind in some distant past or future, because it's not subject to time and change. Our mind is also obviously outside space. This is more obvious because it's not physical. That's to say that the mind is outside time and is eternal, and it's outside space or is infinite. I'd say this only in order to show that our mind may not be able to understand God, but it does have the basis to share his eternity and infinity. And this should be obvious to anyone who looks at themselves. Now, a final point to make before I make a survey of Matthew chapters 15 to 21 and try to elaborate on what I've said here already. The final point is how these things relate to faith. I don't dispute that prayer of the silent type has its value to men of all kinds and in all places, whether they've heard of Christianity or not. It has value to certain forms of yoga, I'm given to understand, and that it has Buddhistic associations where they also advocate meditation, as far as I know. I know little of these things personally, but I believe that the Christian ascetic prayer is a human activity which has beneficial properties to anybody. I'm even prepared to accept that the men of the pagan times, of the Greek times, inadvertently came across the silent prayer and composure of the mind when they were doing their ritual sacrifices of animals, because the priest, standing above the sacred animal, was obliged to offer his thoughts as well as the animal to God whilst using the knife. And he probably became quite practiced in calming all of his thoughts and passions in order to fully perform the ritual. Those rituals also involved trying to pick up on a cosmic sympathy with the world so that they could see omens in the birds and the sky, while they were doing this. Regardless of the truth of of what they believed in, they were naturally gravitating towards the silent prayer. However, I also think that the final end of the meditative state is the state of deep prayer, and that this is the state of faith, if we align it with knowledge of God. By this I mean to refer us to the faith which Christ says that when a man has it, he can order a mountain to throw itself into the sea, and it would do so. It's the faith which, when a man is praying and he has faith in God, his prayer will be answered, which you would call a miraculous happening. Matthew 21, verse 22. The aim of the silent prayer, such as it has one, and every practice has an objective, is to give rest and collection and silence to the mind, and as it were, to do away with all objectives. Achieving this, the heart also is silent. They say that the mind is in the heart when the heart is calm. When the heart is calm, it's because the quiet mind has entered into the heart and governs it, and brings the power that it has, it's of eternity, to the restless heart, the passionate heart. Later, I might mention that there's a part in one of the chapters of Matthew's Gospel where Christ says that the heart is the source of all evils and passions. I don't think this can be doubted, but it's also possible that what I've described as the infinity and the eternity of the mind can be brought into that heart, which is what might purify it. When the mind is in the heart and they are one, then that is the condition of highest faith. For when the mind is in the heart, a person is also open to the approach of God, and nothing of his own personality stands in the way of the approach of the person of God. And the relation of the self to God is faith. This is a commonly understood proposal. When the self relates to God, it relates as faith. And the true self, which allows God to approach, is the silent prayer. This must therefore necessarily be the condition of faith. So in effect, the higher state of the silent prayer is the meaning of the word faith. When we speak of faith in its true sense, this is what we mean. It is when God and man become one, and the man becomes the Son of God. I will leave this there. However, one more point to make on the secretiveness of Christ. I think it has to be said, even though it is obvious, so obvious that we miss it, that we practice the prayer alone, and what happens to us there is not shared. It's not like a landscape or a drama which you can show to anybody and share with a crowd. What happens to us in prayer we see alone, and in fact, everything which happens to us in life really, including viewing the landscape and watching the drama, is also for us alone. In the final analysis, it's just that we don't notice this at the time. But we are conscious of it being to us alone in the prayer, and this makes it secret and private to each man. The secret of it is essential to it. When we normally talk about a secret, we mean that some knowledge which could potentially be shared. But the kind of secret I'm dealing with here can't even be shared, even if we wanted to do so. It's unique. You can't share yourself, and it's utterly private. Since these things happen only to one person, you could say they happen to the only person. Secrecy is not an optional thing, it's in the nature of the whole thing. It can't be expressed or shared with another. And now Christ, not by coincidence, had this character of being unable to share his life or power with others, and often remarked in the Gospels, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long must I be with you? How long must I suffer you?" He said this when he found himself unable to share with his disciples the faith and to see in them the achievements which he would have liked to see them achieve. But the whole world has its character. The whole world is contained in one single individual. And as I've said before, I think this is the message of Christ, actually. And some of the irreconcilable problems in Christianity, such as the possibility of miracles, are explained in that way. The miracles don't even need to happen to two people. They only need to happen to one person. But when the empiricists and the skeptics laugh at the idea of miracles, they're laughing at the fact that you can't share your individuality with anybody else. They're kind of laughing at the limits of human experience, the limitations under which we were born, which has a comical aspect, but is not something which should be scoffed at. To turn to Matthew's Gospel. When I have been reading Matthew recently, I devoted my talks to 7 chapters of his Gospel at a time. And this talk today concerns chapters 15 to 21 of that Gospel. These chapters include those where Peter is said by Christ to be the foundation stone of the church. The chapters include the Transfiguration and Christ's entry into Jerusalem, and the first couple of days that he spent in the city. I intend to make some comments on how individuals, sovereign individuals of the kind I have described, will be able to live together. That is, to look at Christ's instructions to the church, or on the church, which are also found in these chapters. Chapter 15 begins somewhere in the north of the country, and the scribes and the Pharisees have made a journey to come to find Jesus there, to ask him about the behaviour of his followers, to ask him why they don't follow the rituals around washing their hands prior to eating. A quite trivial matter to us maybe, but Christ answers them by saying that when the Jewish officials carry out those rituals themselves, they do so as an offering to God, and they expect praise. They do so expecting praise and reward for their purity rituals. But he says that these traditions rather irritate their Father. And I would interpret this to mean that the inner composure and humility necessary for a relationship with the Father is not brought about by the pride you feel when you follow an instruction successfully. If you follow the instruction of the law to wash your hands before eating, and do so with a feeling of satisfaction, this is not something which brings you closer to God the Father, because the satisfaction and the pride you take in it is an obstacle. Meanwhile, I don't think Jesus meant to tell us not to wash our hands. He meant that the Pharisees were trying to trick him and his disciples and blame them for not following precise rituals. And Christ is basically saying those things are stopping you from having a relationship with God when you practice them as you do. He quotes Isaiah, "This people honours me, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me without cause, teaching doctrines fit only for men." The dirt is in their hearts, and it is that dirt which they need to clean up. In my thesis that Christ was essentially concerned with the inner purity, it's natural that I should explain that Christ was more interested in you cleaning your heart than in cleaning your hands. Jesus explains that they should be careful about what they say too, since what comes out of the mouth can pollute the heart, and that the heart is the site of all kinds of evils. I've already mentioned this in my talk. I would think that Christ would not have set out to look for the priests to abuse them like this. He did not go out looking for them so that he could tell them off in this way. Rather, they came looking for him. And it could be said that they are the men he most admires, the people who are most ready to be shown the truth. They might be converted, and they might form the basis of a church. And yet, as it turns out, they have come to see him because they are planning to get rid of him. the next part of the Gospel, he enters the area of Tyre and Sidon and is approached by a woman whose daughter is vexed by a demon. He tells her that he does not intend to heal non-Jews such as she is, and that the food meant for the children of Israel should not be given to the dogs. And she replies with some wit, but also some persistence, that the dogs can get the crumbs which fall from the table of the children. And so he heals the daughter because of her persistent belief and faith in him. The group then returns to Galilee, and a crowd gathers, wanting healing. Christ calls the disciples together on one of the mountains and arranges for the crowd to be fed there. And this is the second time that a mass feeding with fish and bread has taken place in this Gospel. This time 4,000 are fed in the desert. And when the Sadducees and Pharisees have words with him again in chapter 16, he warns his followers not to trust their food or their teaching. And the disciples, in a rather comic scene, fail to understand that he's talking about what the Pharisees say, their words, is a kind of food. And they thought that he was referring to the feeding of the people. I'd make an observation about the way these things are told by Matthew. What I've just described there is 3 or 4 episodes, and you could say, well, they must have happened in the same day or maybe the same week. It's not the way the narrative is written. This story cannot be taken as a day-by-day exhaustive account of the journeys of Jesus. It would not be possible to create a timeline with exact dates and places based on the information that we are given in this Gospel. But this was a typical way of writing biography at the time. And this is the way that, and Matthew is quite typical in the way he writes the life of Jesus. Historians of the time, in the tradition to which Matthew belongs, do not write history as a comprehensive, exhaustive account, like a diary. Matthew rarely even mentions the date, if at all, and gives locations to us because of the significance of the things that took place there, not because it answers to our interest in historical details. He's not interested in historical details. He's interested in what took place and where it took place. He rarely mentions how much time took place between 2 events. But Plutarch and Suetonius and Tacitus, rough contemporaries of Matthew, don't do that either. They tell us what an eminent man did, possibly where it happened, but they don't give the details between the various episodes and events. And they rarely even tell us the date on which something took place, how old he was at the time. Their aim was to describe a man's character, which they thought of as something given, something that never really changed. And the events that they told us about were just examples of that character. They definitely do not give us every event of a man's life from start to finish, as you might find in a contemporary biography of someone like Enoch Powell or Margaret Thatcher or William Gladstone, numbering thousands of pages. Next, Christ comes to Caesarea Philippi, which is a place in the very far north of Israel. And we are told this because a significant event took place there, and which Matthew was interested in letting us know about, both the event and the place, because I suppose it would become a place of pilgrimage, and he wants to give a definite location to such an important event. It's where Jesus discusses with Peter the future of the church, which hasn't been mentioned in the gospel up until this point. When Jesus asks some of his disciples who the people say that he is, they tell him that the people think he is a prophet, or a prophet reincarnated. And when he asks them who they, the disciples, think he is, Peter answers him and says he thinks that he is the Christ, the Messiah. This knowledge can only have come from God, and is an example of true faith, Jesus then tells him. Faith, when it is knowledge, is a kind of understanding which God gives to a man, when his heart is loyal and steady. And I think that this reinforces what I've already said, that it's a state. Faith is it's not a belief in a specific article, a specific statement or idea. It's a composure of the heart and the mind, such that God is able to influence it and give the man a certainty about something quite basic. Jesus then tells his close followers that he must soon go to Jerusalem, to die there and to be reborn. To which Peter replies that if this is the case, it would be better if they did not go to Jerusalem. And Christ grows angry about this, because the decision not to bother going to Jerusalem is a temptation which he faces. So he says, "Get thee behind me, Satan. A person of the world would say that to me, but I am not of this world." Chapter 16, verse 23. Chapter 17 gives us the event of the Transfiguration, which takes place on Mount Hermon, which is not far from Caesarea Philippi on the border of Lebanon. So this is associated with the discussion with Peter about the future of the church. Well, it happens at a separate location. Nearby Mount Hermon is a cave entrance, which in the ancient world was held to be sacred to the god Pan, and was known as the gate to the underworld, which is why, when Christ now begins to talk of the future of the church, which Peter will found, Jesus says that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. He could be saying the old rituals of Pan, the worship of Pan. Pan was associated with Dionysus, and the gates of hell will not be nothing in comparison with the new church. The old rites of Dionysus will not be able to compare in their greatness with the power of the church. I don't intend here to discuss the Transfiguration itself, which is so important to the Orthodox Christian. It's sufficient to my purpose here to say that the vision of Christ with Moses and Elijah, robed in the white energy of God, is significant to the ascetic silent prayer, since it is considered to be a moment when human eyes saw the actual energy of God the Father as an uncreated light. Seeing the uncreated light, which Gregory Palamas explained as the energy or the activity of God, is a justification or an explanation for the man who does the silent prayer. Because the uncreated light on the mountain at the time of the Transfiguration gives us hope that we will be able to experience and mix with God himself, something which is quite foreign to the scholastic spirit of the Western Church, but which is quite fundamental to the Eastern Orthodox Church. Once again, Christ tells the three intimates, James, John and Peter, not to tell anyone else about what they've seen on Mount Hermon, nor about his being the Christ. This is something that he will disclose at a later time, if at all. There are also parts of this chapter which indicate that the Church will have power to compel people on earth, and the compulsion or liberation which the Church gives to men will be valid in heaven. Chapter 19, verse 18. In this way, the Church is promised to be a way in which earthly authorities will be able to interact with the kingdom of heaven. Later on, the disciples try to cure a lunatic but fail, and Christ grows frustrated, but says that only fasting and prayer will give them enough faith to cure such illness. Indeed, faith comes from fasting and prayer. It puts the mind in the heart, which means it controls the heart, doing away with its unease and evil. As we saw, chapter 17 has Christ speaking about the church. In chapter 18, he continues and lays down some basic rules for how the people of the church will behave toward one another and how they will work things out. If we have assumed, as I do, that the Christian is, at the higher levels of his faith, a purely solitary person and a purely solitary centre of existence and all the world, because he allows the world to happen by his perception and his mind, then the matter of how he will interact with other people must be addressed. How can you have a church made up of such infinitely isolated, self-conscious individuals whose isolation is essential? Well, they will be able to bear with each other and not be so arrogant as to avoid one another and be rude to one another. Because for a start, they must be humble, but we'll get to that. But here, the most essential part, Jesus says, will be that they will forgive one another and that they will take care of the weak and the children as an obligation which must never be betrayed. Jesus goes to some length to ensure that the disciples are very clear. The weak and the young already belong to the kingdom, and anyone who offends or harms them is involved in unforgivable crime. Particularly if a man is able to harm children and the weak, then it would be better for him if he were to do away with himself or dispose of the parts of his body which did the harm, because the children and the vulnerable already have the kingdom and are already part of it. They are the centre of their world already and didn't have to work hard at finding themselves. This is not to say that as time passes and they become older and more complex and move further from their true highest nature, they'll eventually become adults. See that you never harm one of these weak ones, for I say to you that the angels in heaven who guard them are in heaven, always seeing the face of my Father who is in heaven. The parable of the moneylender is told them, which is an instruction about how forgiveness should be reciprocal, and that God will not forgive anyone who cannot forgive others. I should point out that forgiveness, like purity and the other things taught by Christ in general, comes from the heart. Forgiveness is not a calculating virtue. We don't forgive people in order to be forgiven. We forgive people because it's essential to how we must behave, who we are. This is proven by another parable which comes a bit further on in chapter 20, about how men who worked for just 1 hour were paid by a certain master with the same amount of money as men who had worked all day. The story indicates that men must have a pure heart and accept the gifts of God without reference to how it seems to go for other people, and therefore without calculating their advantage or the advantage gained from the kindness of their master. Their relationship with each other should be indifferent and forgiving, even if they perceive inequality or what they might think of as injustice. Because they don't behave like this, the master asks the angry workers, "Can't I do what I want? Is your eye evil because I am doing good? Has my generosity to you made you angry?" The question is meant to be saying how absurd it is that when somebody does good to you, you grow angry. And the servants would probably say, "Yes, but you did good to the other people as well." Well, this is what forgiveness is. It's a kind of an indifference to what's happening to other people, and a living with it, and maintaining your heart pure. Jesus tells this parable in the context of answering the question, how can anyone go to the kingdom of heaven if it's so hard to be pure in this way? It's because it is hard to be pure in this way, to give up all your money, to give up all of your pride and demand for justice. And the answer is that everyone can do what he is capable of in this life. And he will be rewarded if he does just as much as he can. But the worst thing is for men to judge each other because this corrupts them and sets them against each other. And it turns a man into a mere human being when his Christian duty is to have faith and to be more than a human being, and at the ultimate level to join with God. In chapter 19, the group of disciples returns to Galilee, and they cross the Jordan into Israel. There they are, met by a huge crowd. And being back in Judea, there are also Pharisees, naturally, who won't leave him alone. These religious rulers of the people approach him and question him on points of doctrine. In this instance, they want to talk about divorce, which is a complex matter which they hoped would make him look foolish and impious. Christ's answer to them on the subject of divorce, like other judgments on the subject of marriage, is sometimes taken to be, by secular critics of the Bible, people who read the Gospels for reasons of scholarship, it's taken by them to be an absolutely historical and confirmed opinion of his. They don't believe the Gospels can be trusted, and they don't believe in God. But they do agree that Christ really did say these things about marriage and divorce. They do so on the supposition that the church would usually have attributed many things to Jesus, particularly those which are of benefit to the church. So we can have, as an example, they would possibly have reason to doubt the statements of Jesus about the church, because those things are of benefit to the church, and the church may have made them up. But there are few people who can benefit from his words on divorce, because Christ basically compels men to live with their wives to the bitter end, so to speak. And so it has been said that the words of Jesus, which he almost certainly uttered, because they are the most severe and unwelcome to men, concern divorce. So, let me see. I don't myself follow this procedure of sifting out Christ's most convincing, most authentic statements from his less authentic statements, because I believe in God and I believe in the authority of the church. But I'm just making a note about what some secular scholars and how they approach these matters. So the Pharisees ask Jesus whether a man can put his wife away, or, in other words, divorce her. And Christ says that no, a man may not divorce his wife unless she has been an adulteress or has done something equally serious. In what I consider to be a fact of nature, and something which humanistic enlightenment has done nothing to change, Christ explains that mankind is not instanced by a single man or a single woman, but that an instance of the human being is as a pair, because they were designed to be a couple and designed to be joined in marriage. They were made man and woman of one flesh. That's to say, there's no complete natural adult man who is not also married. And human sexual difference means that the complete human being is a pair. Feminism, which presupposes that sexual difference is something to be overcome and set aside, is therefore a terrific, dangerous lie as far as Christ is concerned. But equally, the man who takes the law into his own hands and puts his wife away for his own purposes and finds a new life and a new wife is also operating according to a terrific and dangerous lie. I think the feminist is a more common occurrence in this age, and the selfish and the domineering man who would treat his wife in this way is something from those days, but they're both equally bad. The question put to him was asking whether a man can arbitrarily dispose of his wife, since, I suppose, that in those times men were able to treat their women with such high-handed indifference. And the question is, should the Jews be able to dispose of their women as they please in this way, throwing them out and leaving them destitute? which Christ denies that they should be allowed to do. Now the Pharisees then reply to him, "Yes, but Moses allowed us to divorce." To which he replies that this is because Moses understood that they had hard hearts and that they couldn't live with such hard hearts unless they also had power over their women. But that he, Jesus, is not prepared to allow them to go along with these cruel ways. Good men must never put their wife away. But he qualifies this by saying that men do not absolutely need to be married, because some of them are born as eunuchs and some of them are born as eunuchs for God, and that each man will work out the mystery in his own way, as God the Father has apportioned him his life. So there's no eternal rule about this. But divorce is not something which men should not just put their wives away. The rich young man approaches at this time, and Jesus asks him he asks Jesus how he can be perfect. He says that he already follows the law and the prophets, but wants to be absolutely perfect. Christ replies that the young man should give away all of his money and follow him. The young man is not prepared to do this and walks away sorrowing. Christ smiles and says that a rich man will find it hard to enter the kingdom of heaven, as difficult as a camel would find it to go through the eye of a needle. The disciples murmur among themselves how hard it would be for anyone to enter the kingdom of heaven if they have to give up everything and be perfect. So Christ is forced to tell them that God will look after those who fall short. Since although men find it impossible to give up all things, for God all things are possible. So God will find a way of making men give up things. Maybe not all of their wealth, all of their family. Maybe, for instance, it would be enough that in his heart somebody were perfect. Peter reminds Jesus that they, his followers, have given up everything, and so Christ assures them that they will be rewarded in heaven, in the kingdom. In the 20th chapter, Jesus continues to tell them about this reward and how God allocates life in the kingdom. I've already mentioned one of the parables about this when discussing the labourers who are rewarded equally at the master's discretion for unequal amounts of work. He then tells the wider circle of disciples that they must all go to the city. And he describes for a second time the whole plan, this time to the 12 rather than to James, John, Peter. The mother of the sons of Zebedee approaches and asks if her sons can sit at his right and left hand in the kingdom. This, as well as the two blind men who later approach him, calls to our mind the two men who are crucified next to him later on. And it's quite a clever way of pointing out that the people on the right and left hand side of Jesus are also crucified. And it's as Jesus then says, "What you think you will get when you are in the kingdom, in the highest places, will not be as it is in the world." The other disciples are still anxious to get some kind of worldly success and influence over one another, and they grumble about the priority which seems to be claimed by the sons of Zebedee. Christ tells them that whoever will be in charge of his church will be the servant and not the authority with mastery over the others. I think that it is improper for most men to behave with total humility in the world. There is a need for the state, for money, and for the other things which we need for order, and our need for self-assertion. But where the church is concerned, men will forgive each other for what they are forced to do. And where the priests are concerned, the leaders of the church must be, in their hearts at least, the servants of the people, and not their proud, arrogant, authoritative masters. It's the state of the heart and the mind which determines everything, as we've said. This is how it's possible to say that in the kingdom, the first will be last, and the last will be first. Finally, for the purposes of my talk, the 21st chapter describes Christ's entry into Jerusalem and the first days of his time there. Jesus sends disciples to find an ass and a colt, fulfilling the word of Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. And he is acclaimed as Saviour by the people. Arriving at the temple in the centre of the city, he overturns the tables and tells the authorities that the temple is a place of prayer and not of official business or work. They were treating the temple as a place of work, and he tells them it's a place of prayer. He heals various blind and lame men, and the children proclaim him to be the Son of God, the Son of David. These words by the children make the scribes and priests indignant, particularly when the children proclaim to him that he is the Son of David. He tells the scribes and the priests, "Did you never read it? From the mouths of children and infants you have perfected praise." That night he goes to Bethania, and he curses a fig tree as he passes, which turns out to be the opportunity for him to give a lesson to his disciples. They wonder how it can be that he can make a tree wither just with his words. And he tells them that if they had faith and no hesitations at all, which means the deep faith in the heart of the single mind, then it would be the case that everything, whatever it is that you ask in prayer while believing, you will receive. That's Matthew chapter 21, verse 22. How can the self, which has become God's own self in some way, not also see what it wills to happen, happen? I would suggest that this is how prayers will always be answered, but only in a condition of absolute faith with no hesitation. Back at the temple, the authorities ask Jesus under what power he acts, and he responds by asking them a question. Under what authority did John the Baptist act? Since this exchange takes place in public, his opponents are afraid of the people watching who believed that John was sent by God, so they reply that they don't know, and they refuse to answer him. So he tells them that he won't answer them either. Following which, he tells them two parables. The first about the two sons who are asked to work by their father, and the one who says he will work but doesn't, and the other who says he won't work but resolves later on to do so. And then the apocalyptic story of the labourers in the vineyard who kill any of the servants who are sent to collect the harvest, including the master's own son. Then he tells them that the stone which the builders refused is become the headstone of the corner, which is a quotation from Psalm 118, verse 22 in the King James Bible. The stone will crush and grind to dust anyone who trips over it. And how the priests and the Pharisees would have laid hands on him then, because they knew that these parables were aimed at them, and they knew that he was talking about himself. But the crowd, who believed that he was a prophet, made them afraid, so they didn't. I have some final remarks, which will take 2 minutes. I've spoken about what I think faith is, how it coincides with anyone becoming himself. When you become yourself, your true self, you also have to have faith. You do have faith. The idea of the self requires the idea of God. And the intensification of the idea of self coincides with humility rather than egoism. And it reinforces the Christianity of a person by making him more inward, less interested in the world. Faith is a change of heart made possible by prayer, which Christ told his followers is what makes anyone able to enter the kingdom of heaven. And I'm quick to suggest that faith is not having an idea of something and believing in that idea. Rather, it's a state of the heart in relation to God. We should already believe in God, that he exists. This is pretty straightforward for most people, that God exists. Physicists, when they study the heavens, frequently come to the conclusion that God is scientifically necessary. But I would not call the knowledge which physicists have of God's existence to be faith, because as I've explained, faith is something else. It relates to becoming a unique self, aware of your own centrality to all existence, and aware of being the friend of God, the Son of God. I've also noticed the foundational steps toward making a church, and Jesus' advice on how the members should behave towards one another. Their relationship is one of humility and forgiveness of one another. And among the priests or leaders, the most self-abasing actions should be required. Well, the most self-abasing opinion of their own authority. And the situation shall be that the first shall be the last. I've been reading The Lives of Jesus by Mark Tully. Tully's years are 1935 to 2026. His book was published in 1996, and it accompanied a BBC documentary series about Jesus of that year. Tully's book could be called the BBC's view of Jesus, or at least it is the view which the BBC held before its recent precipitous progressive decline. I read the book because Mr. Tully died very recently, and I decided to go back to that work of his. Jesus is described there in 4 ways to match the 4 episodes of the TV series. Firstly, as a god, then as a Jew, then as a rebel, and then as the hidden Jesus. The hidden Jesus is the one which is the most honest one, is the truth, is the closest that Tully gets to accounting for the real Jesus, I think. Since Tully does not believe in God, none of his work is of use to Christians, except insofar as it yields some interesting insights into scholarship, and it shows us some bits of historical background which are interesting about the time in which Jesus lived. It also reveals what the dry-as-dust academics think about God and Jesus. Nevertheless, as I say, the final chapter, called The Hidden Jesus, investigates the Eastern Orthodox and monastic traditions, and it does not disappoint us quite so much as the earlier ones. Tully interviewed, for example, Archbishop Callistos Ware and considered the Christians of the desert and wondered how they were accepted by the church under Athanasius. I mention this because Tully makes it clear that Christ can be understood as a superb individualist. And in this I agree with him. When considered by a non-believer and by a Christian, Christ clearly was so. And the depths and the high reaches of this individualism and what it means are only received to those who pray in experience. Needless to say, if anyone were to object to my idea that Christ was an individualist, I need only point to the fact that Christ was the Son of God, and that he frequently himself had difficulty coming to grips with the distance between him and his own followers. But this is clear, this is obvious stuff. What more interests me is the individuality of every Christian when they engage in honest prayer with God. Tully is aware of this contradictory nature of the Church and Christianity, because he also considers how, after 325 AD, when the Christians as a whole were accepted by the Roman state, the monastic ascetic impulse flowered and almost exploded, and men who had previously lived as internal exiles inside the Roman Empire were no longer exiles, and so they seemed to rush into the desert so as to maintain their isolation, which was no longer natural inside Rome and which could only be found in the desert. Their inner exile, whilst under the old empire, was no longer possible, and so they had to find the desert. That's to say, a certain isolation was essential for the Christian at all times. Until he also points out that the monastic orders which then developed have an uneasy relationship with the Church, because they are naturally outside of its authority or its daily worship, being so far removed. The Church is broadly for the people, and it's the means by which the people get together and worship together. But there also is a place for the higher forms of spirituality and nearness to God, which directly confront God without the sacramental life which the Eastern Church offers. But the Eastern Church has also, from the beginning, tolerated and sometimes encouraged the isolated ascetic life. This is where I end my presentation. In the next one, I will look at the final chapters of St. Matthew's Gospel and consider two specific things along the way, namely the role of the state for the Christian people, and I mean the nation state, the government, and the role and purpose of evil in this as it is permitted by God. Thanks for listening.